Right now, America's farmers are really feeling the pressure. Crop prices are low, borrowing costs are high, and trade tensions with China aren't helping. However, this isn't the first time America's agricultural sector has faced economic hardship. Today, we'll look at past farm crises and what they can teach us about the challenges farmers are facing now. I'm Johanna Bota, and here to help us break it all down is StoneX's Chief Commodities Economist, Arlan Suderman. Good morning to you, Arlan. Great to have you back. I want to start with a little bit of a history lesson. So, what have been the major farm crises in the U.S. over the past century?
Well, probably the top crisis was in the 1930s, the Great Depression. That was followed closely by the 1980s. That's when I started my career. So that was a very dark time in agriculture as well, when suicides were very high, farm failures were very high, and farm sales were a regular component in the farm industry. Um, then we had some other periods that were scattered throughout the 80s and 90s and even the early 2000s. But when people reference the current farm crisis, or they want to reference a farm crisis, there's not many people around anymore who remember the 1930s. So they generally will reference the 1980s.
So let's stick with the 1980s because it's often seen as the benchmark for tough times in agriculture. What made that period so severe?
Well, similar to what we're in now, it was preceded by a time of inflation. And inflation in the 1970s, late 1970s, was very high, and a lot of assets were flowing into land, and land prices were rapidly rising. And so that was a time of less regulation in the banking industry. And so many farmers would be talking to their banker and mention that the um, piece of land across the road was up for sale, and the banker would say, "Why don't you buy it?" And the farmer would say, "Well, I don't have enough money for a down payment." And the bank would say, "Well, we'll loan you the money for 100% of the value of the land because land prices are going up, so that won't be a problem." Well, that's not a problem until it is a problem. Um, I mentioned the inflation during the late 1970s. Also, a piece of that driving land prices up is we had very good grain prices that had been precipitated by the great grain robbery of Russia coming in and buying up our supply of wheat and other commodities. So grain prices were good as part of that inflationary period as well. So the optimism in agriculture is high. People overextended themselves in borrowing to purchase those land because they thought land would continuously always go up. Well, then in the 1980s, everything came to a halt. We had the embargo over Afghanistan, no longer exporting to Russia. That's when Russia was a major importer rather than an exporter as it is now. And so grain prices collapsed, land prices started to break. As those land prices broke, then farm loans were underwater, foreclosing on the land. More land got dumped onto the market. It just kept snowballing on itself. Farms were failing on a regular basis, and we'd overproduced grain because our export markets were hurting. Government was buying grain, but the markets wouldn't recover because the markets knew that as soon as prices recover, the government would dump more of that grain back onto the market. So it was a perpetual cycle that kept hurting agriculture.
That's interesting about Russia because here we are 40 years later, and again, we're looking at punishing Russia for invading another country. So, how do today's challenges compare with what farmers faced in the 1980s?
That's a very difficult question to answer because there are farmers who are certainly hurting as bad as what those farmers did then. So I'll answer the question twofold: for the individual farmers and sectors, and then as the sector as a whole. For some individual farmers, we have a whole generation of young farmers who entered the industry over the last 15 years who knew nothing but low interest rates and good prices for a period of time. And now they're having to adjust to a different environment of higher interest rates and low prices. And this is a very difficult adjustment for them. We're dealing with far larger revenue numbers now than what we did back when they started. And what we're seeing is a growth in loan value. We're seeing production loans being carried over from year to year because they can't pay off their production loans with the crop that they just produced. And so debt is starting to mount. They're getting discouraged. They've not been through a time like this before, and it's very difficult, and we are seeing some farm failures. When you look at the sector as a whole, the livestock industry is doing very well for the most part. There are some exceptions. Most part, it's doing very well, driven by a shortage of protein in this country, a shortage of meat, and so livestock prices are hitting record highs. Consumer demand remains strong. The industry is doing well. Midwest farmers are, for the most part, doing well. Those farmers who are suffering the most are those in the more marginal areas where margins tend to be narrower anyway, like in the plains or in the Mid-South, places like that. When you look at the broad picture of the whole agriculture sector, net farm income this year is expected to be around $179 billion. Roughly $40 billion of that will be farm payments. The farmers would rather get their value from what they produce, but that's helping to carry farmers over, and there's probably another assistance package coming from the Trump administration to farmers that's being discussed now. So that's helping get them through. Overall, that's one of the highest net farm incomes that we've had, but it is largely because of government payments that are helping them do that. So some farmers are still doing okay, but they're pulling back and being more conservative and cautious. Others are hurting. The sector as a whole has certainly seen better days, but we're nowhere close to what we were. Farm loan delinquencies are at about 1.9% right now. That compares to over 7% in the 1980s.
Also, correct me if I'm wrong, but back in the 2000s, the downturn was mostly driven by global markets. Are we actually seeing something similar today?
We are seeing something similar today as we're changing our trade routes, we're changing our trading partners. The tariff war is certainly having an impact of that. The loss of China is largely an impact for the soybean market. When you look at corn exports, USDA is projecting record high corn exports. On the other hand, soybean export demand may fall to the lowest level that we've seen in maybe 15 years. And that's largely due to the loss of China. So it depends on the commodity. Wheat export projections right now are at about 5-year highs. So it really varies by commodity.
So we've talked about what's similar and what's different compared to past crises. What can today's farmers and maybe even policymakers learn from these experiences?
About a year ago, it was actually a little over a year ago, in many of the regular media interviews that I did, as well as public presentations that I did, I warned that we were entering into the downturn in the ag cycle. Been in this business for about 45 years, and I've been through a number of these cycles, and they tend to last for several years, but we always come out of them. Cheap prices do generate demand that bring us out of it. But I said we need to change our philosophy. Farmers tend to market to trying to get the highest price that they possibly can, and kind of what we call in baseball terms, try to hit home runs. And I said over the next year or two or three, we need to focus on base hits, learning your marketing strategies, work with somebody who is adept at marketing, just as you work with an agronomist to help you know what fertilizers or chemicals to use on your crops and what advice for agronomically you want. Work with someone who can help you learn the tools, know the tools that you use to make base hits in your marketing on basis improvement, taking advantage of the carry in the market with the deferred futures contracts, little things like that, with the focus of making sure you're in business a year from now. You may be accepting prices that you don't like, but prices that will help make sure you're still in business a year from now. And I think that's the key. Now, farmers passed up some opportunities to do that over the last year that put them in a worse situation right now. There were prices that maybe they say wouldn't have given them a profit, but combined with the government checks, it may have done that. And so they passed that up because they didn't like the price. And they need to change the mindset to be defensive in their marketing rather than aggressive right now, because it's all about surviving until the cycle changes once again.
Arlan, thank you so much for your insight, and thank you to our viewers for watching. For more financial content, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.